Hello, everyone. Pia Mancini here, co-founder and CEO at Open Collective. My presentation today is called The Future is Collective and some thoughts on open source sustainability. I am thrilled to be here with you, tuning in from Madrid. So here we are. The TLDR, if there's one thing that I want you all to take from my presentation today is how we think about sustainability. Sustainability refers to the resilience and the thriving of projects, communities, and the individuals that surround them. So we're not talking about financial sustainability. We're not talking just about money, or we're not talking just about like one aspect. We really have a holistic view. We understand sustainability as the capacity that communities have of withstanding change and changes in the environment, in the ecosystem, in changes for the folks that are in those projects. So that's how we think about sustainability. So really this kind of quite comprehensive perspective that we have. And so the premise that we have, that we operate under, something that really guides our thinking is, it has been really well expressed in my view by Tobias from Webpack. He said that open source software is not free, somebody else paid for it, right? And again, this somebody else, maintainers, that they pay for it with their time away from their families, time, that they're normally that's unpaid volunteer time that they're putting into these projects that everyone else is taking for free. So what is the issue with this? Well, the problem is that, right, that high tech is a 4.3 trillion industry that relies on open source projects that are cultivated, are taken care of by a community of really underpaid, if they are ever paid, or volunteer maintainers, right? And most of our digital infrastructure relies on the volunteer work of folks who are in this space. So here we go. So what is the problem with open source, or why is it so hard to fund open source? So if we think about it, like the attributes that open source has as a public good means that it's a non-excludable public good, right? Like it's not scarce. Once your work, your software is out there, you do not have a way of gating it. You do not have a way of making it available only for some people and not for others. And there's really no marginal cost for another person to use the code. There is like no cost for the user, right? But as we can see, there's a lot of costs for the people that are creating this technology, right? Again, and Dominic Tarr, I don't know if you remember, but he did this software called Event Stream that was used by millions of apps out there, and then someone started contributing to Event Stream, and Dominic had already moved on from that technology. He was doing something else. He didn't even think that technology was the best solution for the problem that he was trying to solve, but he had authored this. It was there. It was in millions of applications, so there was this responsibility. So these other contributors started quite consistently contributing, and then one day he's like, hey, if you're not taking care of this anymore, do you want to give me the keys to the castle? And Dominic is like, sure, why not? I'm not using it anymore. And then that other contributor used Event Stream to inject a malware that was designed to steal Bitcoin from certain applications, right? And so in the middle of all the aftermath of this drama, Dominic said a module is like a piece of digital property, a right that can be transferred, but you do not get any benefit owning it. You can't sell it, you can't rent it, but you still retain the responsibility, right? So here, I think that in this is where it lies really the biggest issues that we have with funding open source. That is these community imbalances that are at the core of the open source ecosystem. on the one hand, we have this reality where posting an issue has zero cost for the person posting an issue. Hey, can you fix this? Or how does this work? Or are you going to be doing any breaking changes coming up? Or why is this thing not working? And those are the nicest ones, right? Normally it's like a different language, vernacular language. Companies are hooked on open source, right? Like, of course, why wouldn't you? When we started Open Collective, we obviously used open source. Like, granted, we're a company that has dedicated itself to solving this particular problem. But even before that, when we were building a platform like anyone else who's building tech, you use everything that is available, right? And so the cost of starting a company has decreased enormously from thanks to open source, and companies have no interest in obviously going back. And so what this means is that you have increasingly more and more people that are extracting value from a repo than those that are maintaining it, right? So you have this imbalance between like the users that are just extracting value from the artifact of some creators, and those creators are maintaining that for free, basically. And so you share your code, but you do not share the responsibility. Now, I'm not saying that open source maintainers do not get anything from doing open source. That is not what I'm saying. I mean, obviously there is like a whole incentive system here that is operating. You get to work on cool things, you get to learn, you get to try stuff, you build a name for yourself, you build a career for yourself, right? It's challenging, it's interesting. You meet people, you network. So it's your personal brand. So I am not saying that. I'm just saying that it's easy to start a project and do all of that, but then maintaining that project, it's really hard, right? And leaving that project is really hard. And that's where once you have a popular project that is, spread around the whole economy pretty much, then you have like a sense and a level of responsibility that is quite daunting. And so what we need to think about, I think, is what we at Open Collective are trying to think. If you think about like my TLDR, right, how we think about sustainability in this kind of quite holistic way, then the solution to making decentralized communities sustainable also needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be holistic. It needs to have it needs to address all of these different components. So we need to figure out ways of paying maintainers in a way that is comparable to what a corporation does, right? Like the goal of the open source collective, which is the nonprofit that we created to support the whole open source ecosystem, really our goal is to make working for open source as interesting, as financially rewarding as working for a corporation, because then then is when you're talking at the same level, right? And then the second thing has to do, in my mind, with how you can make your communities, your project sustainable, has to do with diversifying the skill sets that people have in your project. If you only have, just people with a very similar skill set, you might have quite a deep or very elegant, software or solution, or it's going to be technically very, very good. But if your goal is to sustain a community of people working on that, you need to think about how you're diversifying the skill sets that you bring, right? And so folks who are able to onboard other people, folks who are able to work on addressing, kind of gardening the community, organizing the events, making sure that things inside of the comments or the GitHub issues are civil, that GitHub issues, or not just GitHub, but like whatever you use, issues get triaged and they get properly prioritized, the documentation gets, the attention that it deserves, etc. And again, it's all about resilience, diversifying the skill sets, diversifying your revenue streams. It's going to make your community more resilient. It's going to be able to, if you just depend on one revenue stream, if you just depend on, say, for example, a project that only has one company putting money into that project, you might have, a good financial standing, but if that revenue stream gets compromised, like, it's going to be very difficult for you. And this is not just in open source, it happens everywhere, right? Obviously, but think about this when you're thinking. And again, invest heavily in community resilience, right? So onboarding, docs, the type of things that wants to make people come to your community. Now, okay, so financial sustainability is obviously like one key aspect here, right? We need to get people paid for the work they do, right? And we have like a really big pain point that it's quite obvious by now that in the open source world, formal contracts and partnership agreements don't happen in the way they do in the business world, right? Why? Because open source projects in general, open source communities, let me say, are not legal entities. And we live in a world where corporations speak to corporations in a scarcity-driven economy that assumes that everyone has a legal entity. And if you're just a bunch of people doing, great technology distributed around the world, using, a platform like GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, whatever it is, then companies do not understand what you are. You, in our like lingo, you are a circle in a world that is made for triangles. And so that like clashes, right? And I love this tweet from Swift on security. I am convinced that many developers have no freaking idea how business actually works and what operations departments have to go through to make things happen. Like, enrolling a new vendor is more than difficult, is demoralizing. It eats souls. If you make it easy, you are a god. So, and I mean, it's funny, I get it, but also I don't think developers should, kind of be so worried about this. Not that you shouldn't be worried, but like, really, it's not in your skill set, which is going back to kind of bringing diverse skill sets into this. Like, you are, super busy doing your job, doing your project, trying to hold your community together. Like, enrolling in like a vendor system with SAP, for example, I don't know what to say. It's like the worst. And so that's why we created kind of Open Collective, because we wanted to create this digital interface between the projects and then the host organizations and then, the governments. Like, that's what we do. We created this way of helping projects talk to companies without having to become a company themselves, right? So Open Collective, essentially what it does, is a platform that allows open source projects to receive money. But the open collective is a constellation of the platform that is transparent, where you can see how the money is being spent, where the money is going, right? It allows you to have recurring donations, but like, it's the platform plus like this network of host organizations around the world that receive the money. So the host organizations, that we call them fiscal hosts, are the ones who talk to companies, talk to reporting. So the Open Source Collective is a full-blown 501c6 incorporated in California, and we can talk to any company, any foundation out there. The same with the Open Collective Foundation, and the same, like, for example, Ruby Together, right, which we didn't create, but they can use the Open Collective platform to receive funding for their projects. So kind of that's one part of obviously of the solution. And yes, we will go through your sponsors vendor setup process for you. That, I kid you not, it looks like that sometimes. So here we are. So right now we have 3,343 open source projects. We've facilitated 30 million in project directed funding. And I just want to kind of emphasize this idea of project directed funding. For me, this is super important. We do not get involved in how the projects spend the funding. I mean, it's transparent. We get involved in the compliance, obviously, but we do not get involved in how they decide the money should be spent. If you want to spend it equally, if you want to distribute it equally in across all maintainers, that's fine. If you want to spend it just on community stuff like organizing events or paying someone to a technical writer for your dogs, that's also fine. Like we don't get involved. So like the money is from the projects. We're like interfacing. We're just enabling you to hold it, right? That for us is very, very important. And wow, that looks very big. I'm not sure if it looks that big for you, but anyway, like the transparent aspect of it is key for us. Like we created this fund with Samsung Next that distributed like $680,000, and it was in full transparency, right? And it was really easy for them because they just sent us one check for this money, then we turn it around, and then we distribute it ourselves to all of these projects. So really, it's about making it easy for companies to give funding to projects. But it's also about compensating, right? So it's about collaborating and it's about compensating. So in the past 12 months, we've spent $23 million in payments to maintainers, right? That's a lot of money that we paid out. Again, it's all about trying to get maintainers and community volunteers and community members in general being compensated for the amazing work that they do. So why is Samsung or any other company giving money to open source, right? What are the incentives for corporate funding? And then I'll share some examples from this. So the first is naming the community as a good corporate citizen, right? Like if you wanna, you're using a project, you're using software that you didn't create. If you are a good citizen and you want to be perceived and known as you should, as a good corporate citizen, this kind of supporting open source projects and investing in open source projects gives you that kind of name and standing in the community. Some companies invest in open source projects because they get early access to information like breaking changes, for example. They get some strategic influence in the roadmap. Now, I think there's a whole thing here that we need to discuss about governance also. I mean, again, sustainability has to do with like this holistic perception and this holistic understanding. And so when we have an influence in the roadmap and we have a lot of corporate funding, think about your different revenue streams, think about the governance, think about the transparency of that corporate funding, right? Like Open Collective, I think, makes it easier because you know how much each company has given to each project. But it's not just about transparency, it's also about how you decide to communicate this to your community and what kind of access you give them. There's different projects that do different things, like you can give them voting rights on prioritization or whatever. But really think about kind of corporate funding also, not just in dollars, but also in terms of like the governance of your project. Access to maintainers, time and knowledge. Like when open source, if you think about what I said before about it being a public good that you cannot restrict access to, the one thing that you can restrict access to is time and knowledge, right? Maintainers' time and knowledge. Hiring is a competitive advantage in hiring, helps with retention. We know that, we've heard this over and over and over again from companies. Obviously increases the open source stack health, and because it's the fucking right thing to do, essentially. Sorry, but if you're taking something for free, you need to give something back. So some examples of how we've seen this playing over the years. Like we've been doing this for 6 years now. Well, coming up to 7 actually. So Patrick from Trivago, he says, we noticed this effect that we didn't expect, like all the public visibility that they received from like supporting Webpack being really very early on, was that they became one of the most interesting companies to work for as a JavaScript developer. Like they were having folks applying for jobs at Trivago, saying that they knew how much they invested in open source. Here from Henry from Babel, major sponsors can access dedicated support, which is really worthwhile. So it's far better to communicate directly with them versus posting GitHub or Twitter and waiting for someone to see it. Mike Sharov from Adobe, he said this from Webpack as well, and Babel. Giving money to Webpack meant access to Sean Larkin. This was a couple of years ago. An invaluable bundle of optimization insights. Right? Think about access to information. Giving money to Babel via employing, so different models here. But then Henry left Babel, and Babel still supported. Left Adobe, and Adobe still supported Babel through Open Collective. And they think about this is key. They weren't donations. These were like investments, right? And so, what can you kind of do with this funding, or how can you help your community get these kind of corporate funding bounties? Is a really good way of doing it. Like Jay Hipster has like an amazing experience with this. I really encourage you to reach out to them. How they help critical issues to be solved quicker. If you are like a gold sponsor, you can create bug bounties. So it creates this kind of ecosystem and economic incentives. Universal viewer. Again, if another model here for you to think about. You get a steering group seat, right? Having a steering group is really, I think it's a really interesting proposition, because again, when you think about companies having corporate or giving you corporate funding and having access to kind of your roadmap and being able to have pressure on your roadmap and decisions and things like that, I think that having a steering committee makes that more institutionalized, and so it will help you as maintainers to kind of put some boundaries in place. Of course, Open Source Collective is more than happy to chat about any of these things whenever you want. But I think that you cannot just throw corporate money at the problem. You need to think about infrastructure to support the community, as well as the individual members of that community, right? Again, going back to the TLDR. So we've been working on some like super interesting ecosystem initiatives. The first one that you probably many of you already know, it's Sustain, where we created this one-day conversation about sustaining open source. We did several of these events around the world, and really is like getting 100 people in a room, practitioners, sustainers, corporate fundings, foundations, kind of discussing what we can do about open source sustainability, creating like a common taxonomy about what open source sustainability means, creating those kind of offers and needs moments, etc. So Sustain is like this is how we hold this space. First Responder was an initiative we did when COVID-19 hit. Like a lot of open source communities, like their events were canceled, and so they lost a lot of revenue coming from sponsorships. Think about, again, diversifying revenue streams, right? Obviously, this is like hopefully a once in a lifetime event, but if all your money is coming from your conference sponsorships, then if something like this happened, and what do you do? So we very quickly kind of pulled together like some interesting funding to support a lot of open source projects that would suddenly like realize that they were losing all their funding. We have this integration with GitHub sponsors. It's not about competing, it's about collaborating, right? So if you want to receive corporate funding via GitHub sponsors, we can create a collective for you. We're integrating with them. So, the money goes straight from GitHub to the open source collective, to your collective. Once a month, we just put the sponsorships there. We also created democratic funding, funding open source. It was an effort to do community signaling of what projects They wanted to support. We use quadratic funding. You can read more about this initiative. I'm very excited about this. Like we just did the one pilot, but like in collaboration with Gitcoin and Sustain. But I think we might bring this back because it was a very interesting experiment. Um, we created these two funds to support the open source developers supporting Ukraine. So a lot of collectives, open source projects that have collectives, they pulled money together from their collectives to support Ukraine. So it was really easy for them because we're all under the open source collective umbrella. So we created this fund to support Ukraine. And then when the United States left Afghanistan, a couple of open source contributors were stuck there. Their family, they couldn't leave. And so open source contributors just put money together, and we helped two open source developers and their families like escape Afghanistan. So and this one is really important. We offer workshops and coaching for community leaders, like with Sumana and ChangeSet. So again, and this is free, it's about thinking about your project as a community. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up soon. A word on things that are not money, but they also matter, okay? So pay attention. Please pay attention here. Democratizing is not just about opening access, it's about open access and shared and participatory governance. So when you're thinking about your code, when you're thinking about your community, it's not just my code is there, you can access it. It's really about creating communities that have shared and participatory governance. And do not sleep on culture. This is key. If culture and the humanity of what we're doing, the fact that we are individuals, we're humans, that we are sharing, we're collaborating, we're growing together, if that gets away from you, there's like no money going to save your community. It's just, there's no money that is going to save it, right? There's no enough corporate funding that is going to save it. So do not sleep on culture. And democratic culture is upstream of democratic institutions, right? So this is key. If we want to create open, democratic communities, we need to think first of open democratic culture. Now, Open Collective, we've grown from open source. We are now funding a variety of public goods, common grassroots communities, and social and political movements as well. So impacts in the solidarity economy, climate justice, global movements, civic participation. So it's really an invitation for you to kind of not just think about open source, but also how open source kind of seeps into or has these networks and is linked to all of these other communities that we're creating these bridges between the mutual aid groups and tech and climate justice and digital rights. So it's about like all of these intersections. That's how we are thinking. Like we keep growing into this holistic view. We've disbursed $65 million into the hands of communities, and we currently have 15,000 communities on the platform. And again, like Open Collective and what's the future for us, as many of you know, Open Collective, we have the nonprofits, but Open Collective Inc. in itself, it's a company that has VC funding, has investors. And so, we're always thinking about, and for me, this is really something that I think about a lot. I think that what we're building here is infrastructure for the commons, and I'm obsessed about how we can get the commons to own Open Collective, right? So we think that the people closest to the pain has to be the closest to the solution. So the future for Open Collective is an exit to community, right? How we can really have the community owning Open Collective Inc. And so we are thinking about how we can structure a trust that is going to start buying the shares of Open Collective into the trust, and it's going to have community governance and ownership. And then in the future, hopefully, like revenue sharing, right? So that is the future of Open Collective. And this, for me, this is what I'm most excited about today. It's about really having Open Collective Inc. owned by the community that it's serving. So that's it, folks. that's it from me. I'm here, Pia at opencollective.com, at Pia Mancini on Twitter. Yes, we're still there in spite of Elon, but I don't know where else to go. I mean, in obviously in the Fediverse, but I'm still on Twitter. So yeah, come find me. Let's talk. Have a good one, and thank you very much for having me.